Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever in the world you may be joining us today. My name is Jeroen de Wolf. I'm the director of the UC Berkeley Institute of European Studies, and also director of the Austrian Studies program here at Berkeley. And together with my colleagues from the Center Austria at the University of New Orleans, and my colleague Julia Nelson, I would like to welcome all of you to today's event on sustainability and renewable energy, learning from the Alps. This is the second of a series of events on innovation and sustainability, organized by the Austrian Studies programs in North America in partnership with the Office of Science and Technology Austria at Washington, DC. Now, before we introduce today's speaker, I would like to ask my colleague, Julia Nelson, to briefly introduce today's event and say a few words on the series. So Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeroen. Hello, everyone. Welcome, as Jeroen said, to the second installment of our 2021 series on science, technology, and innovation for a sustainable future. Sustainability is one of the key shared priorities of our Austria centers this year in partnership with OSTA at the Austrian Embassy. And with these transatlantic conversations, our goal is to bring experts together in dialogue to share creative approaches to sustainability across different fields, from environmental science to engineering to the arts and humanities. We encourage you to check out the full lineup on our website, and I will drop the link in the chat in just a few moments. Before we get started, I wanted to thank our partners in organizing this series, in particular, Simona Putcher, Matthew Long, and Ali Bo Nielsen at OSTA, and also our co-sponsors, the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at UC Berkeley Law School and the Center Austria at the University of New Orleans. Today's session will offer a historical perspective on renewable energy by way of the Alps. Though it isn't widely known, as our panelists will explain, these idyllic mountain landscapes were a crucial source of clean power for Europe throughout the 20th century. We're excited to learn more about this under-recognized history of the Alps and what they can teach us about a green future. So to introduce our panelists, let me turn it over now to our moderator, Anna Katharina von Krauland, who is a PhD candidate at the Atmosphere Energy Program of the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at Stanford University.
Great, thank you for the introduction, Julia. Just to elaborate a little bit, I'm really passionate about solving climate change through renewable energy, and my PhD project is actually focused on creating a wind energy atlas that maps the technical and social parameters for wind farm siting across the US to find the most promising sites for development. And the goal is to provide a tool for developers and policymakers to speed up the wind energy installation process. And for this project, I'm actually working with a team in Denmark that has mapped all of Europe, and we're now working to expand our analysis to other countries. I'm also the president of the Stanford Austria Club, where we host events for Austrians and German speakers at Stanford. And so it's my great pleasure to be here today to bridge my interests of renewable energy with the Austrian community. As you know, President Biden has proposed a new infrastructure plan that would cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by the end of the decade and lead to a net zero economy by 2050. The plan calls for the installation of massive amounts of new renewable energy, which is very ambitious because only 17% of US electricity generation today comes from renewable sources. Meanwhile, Austria is far ahead as a country in its use of renewable energy, as 77% of the country's electricity comes from renewables, a large percentage of which has historically come from hydropower, which is still true to this day. In fact, Austria's government is committed to achieving carbon neutrality no later than 2040, and has set a target of 100% renewable electricity supply by 2030. Austria's natural resources give it an advantage both from an air pollution and climate perspective, but views on hydropower and how to use it has changed a lot over the years. This is a particularly relevant time to be having this talk when the renewable energy landscape is changing so quickly. So I'm super excited to be joined by two faculty members who are experts on renewable energy in Austria. The first, Marc Landry, is a professor at the University of New Orleans. He is an environmental historian of modern Europe with a regional focus on Central Europe. His research interests center on the environmental history of the 19th and 20th century Europe, particularly the environmental contexts of industrialization and the two world wars. As Associate Director of Center Austria, he co-edits the annual journal series Contemporary Austrian Studies. He also spent 2016 in Innsbruck, where he researched and wrote about alpine hydropower. Welcome, Marc, and thanks for being here today. Patrick Cooper is a professor of economic and social history at the University of Innsbruck. His main fields of interest are the history of environment, technology, and knowledge in the 19th and 20th centuries. He received his PhD from the University of Zurich in 2003 and his habilitation from ETH Zurich in 2011. He has published on the history of conservation, environmentalism, nuclear energy, natural sciences, and higher education. Patrick, we're very grateful that you could join us. So when we're talking about renewable energy in the Alps, we're primarily talking about hydropower. Throughout the next hour, we're going to be exploring renewable energy from a historical context and how perspectives have shifted over the years as society's needs and challenges have evolved. In fact, the term renewable energy itself is relatively recent, which shows just how much energy needs have changed. Patrick will start us off with a brief presentation to give us a backdrop for why this has been and continues to be such an important topic. So Patrick, over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And also thank you to the organizers for inviting me. And I will now try to share a short presentation with you. So I'm not very used to Zoom, as we have another program here, but I hope I will get this right. So, can you see it now? The presentation? Yes. Oh, okay. So now I see some very different kinds of screen. Well, historians try to make sense of our present world by telling stories about its past. And thus I like to tell you a short story about one particular place in the Alps. So here you see a map of the central parts of the Alps, and the place I like to take you to is called the Lower Engadine. It's not in Austria, but very close to. It's in the southeastern part of Switzerland, bordering to both Italy to the south and to Austria to the north. And I'm not sure, can you also see my pointer here? Yes, okay. So here you have Austria in the south, you have Italy, and I like to talk about this place here, the Lower Engadine. If you go up the river a few kilometers, you come to famous resorts in the Upper Engadine, like St. Moritz, and this river will be important. It's the Engadine River, but it changes its name as soon as it enters to Austria, then it gets to the Inn River, and then you follow it for some 150 kilometers, you get to my place, to Innsbruck. The highlighted area forms the Swiss National Park, which is also the core zone of a Biosphere Reserve, which extends south into the Valley Mustaya, this one here. Biosphere reserves, as you may know, serve as model regions for sustainable development, which connects this place to our overall topic of this conversation series. In addition, the same area is also used to produce considerable quantities of renewable energy. And as I will show you in the following, both these issues, sustainable development and renewable energy production, are not recent phenomena, but have been a defining character of this place already for a very long time. One alpine source for renewable energy are its forests. The one in the Lower Engadine had been used for centuries to cover local demand of both firewood and timber. In the 18th century, however, we see the beginning of massive clear cuttings. The reason for this you find when moving down the Inn River just past Innsbruck, about here, to the town of Holl in Tyrol, which has been a long-time center of salt production, first mentioned in the 13th century. As producing salt required large quantities of energy, the salt works were in permanent need of wood. When the nearby forests were exhausted, they started to obtain wood from places further and further upstream the Inn Valley, as in those times the only way to economically transport bulky items such as wood was by floating them on rivers. And thus, clear cutting eventually arrived in the lower Engadine. Such large-scale exhaustion of forests and deforestation did not go unnoticed. Indeed, it was exactly in this context that the concept of sustainable yield first took shape, expressed most famously around 1700 by the Saxonian mining administrator Hans Carl von Carlowitz. But the concept was also voiced in many parts of the Alps, where it was joined by a discourse which asked if deforestation diminished the area's capacities to hold back water, and thus was responsible for severe flooding occurring downriver, hitting urban centers as Innsbruck. By investigating this question, 18th and 19th century contemporaries connected environmental degradation in one place with catastrophic societal impacts in another. Over the 19th century, we see large-scale logging of alpine forests first slowing down and then stopping, but only partly due to the objections raised against logging. Another main reason was, paradoxically, the advent of the fossil fuel age, and thus the age of environmental unsustainability. This age not only saw profound changes in energy production and use, for example, replacing firewood by coal, but also revolutions in transport, first by the railway and then by the car. Under the new conditions, the exploitation of alpine forests became simply uneconomic. For the inhabitants of the lower Engadine, this was not good news. It meant a severe economic crisis. A crisis, however, which in turn helped nature conservationists to lease land and to create in the early 20th century the Swiss National Park, the first national park in Europe. Its founders were well aware of the former uses of the territory, but believed that when they strictly protected the area from any human interventions, nature itself would turn it into a wilderness again. Together with nature conservation also came tourism into the valleys, and likewise a new interest into exploiting water power. Harnessing water power for local mechanical use had a century-long tradition, but the harnessing of water power for producing electricity and the technology to transmit this electricity over long distances brought a fundamental change. The tapping of alpine rivers for the power demand of faraway urban and industrial centers. Early 20th century projects for the lower Engadine were not realized, but after World War II and against the resistance of nature conservationists, a much larger project was built. And here you see a detailed map of this highlighted area with this water work that was realized. It involved a whole system of pipes, dams, and reservoirs, profoundly rearranging the region's water regime, tunneling the national park area, and opening up the possibility to, for example, pump water from the Inn River all up to the Lago di Livigno, an artificial lake on former pasture land. So this one here, and here you see the pipe which was used for both to pump up water and to let water down again to produce electricity. This way, it could provide additional capacities to store water and thus power, something Marc may talk more about in a minute. Furthermore, in order to build the huge dam of Punta Gal, they needed lots of concrete, and they had to bring it to this very remote place. This meant that the workers first had to dig a tunnel for trucks. You see this tunnel here, which once the dam was constructed, was opened to traffic. By this, the power plant also created a new route to the Italian village of Livigno, here at the bottom, which, thanks to it, developed to a major ski resort. Ever since, most tourists have used the new tunnel to reach Livigno by car, passing on their way through most of the Biosphere Reserve and the National Park. So I will stop here and leaving the lessons to learn from this story for our follow-up discussion. If you like to know more about it, well, I'm happy to answer your questions, but also like to point you to my book, Creating Wilderness. And with this, I hand you over to Marc or Anna.
Okay, yes. Great. Thank you, Patrick, for the great visualization. And it's fantastic to have someone who's actually in the Alps and can give us a firsthand account, as I understand that you're actually located on a historical site on the river. So now, yes, let's go over to Marc, who will expand on these ideas and give us a sense of the scale of hydropower.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Hopefully, can you see my screen okay now? Excellent. Well, thank you, Patrick and Anna-Katharina as well for the introduction. Thank you, Anna-Katharina. And I also want to say thank you to the organizers, to OSTA, the Institute of European Studies and the Austrian Studies program, as well as the Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment for organizing this, in particular, Jeroen de Wolf and Julia Nelson, also Matt Long, but also thank you to the other worldwide Austrian centers for this great initiative to talk about a really important issue, sustainability. So we're shifting now, I'm speaking from New Orleans, where we have the Center Austria, one of these worldwide Austrian centers. And so Patrick is speaking to us from, I don't know, 500, 200 meters above sea level or something like that. I'm very close to below sea level here in New Orleans, as are large parts of the city. So somewhat of a shift in perspective. But again, I think in this conversation, we're both approaching this issue of sustainability and of energy from a historical perspective. So I think what hopefully we can add to conversations about sustainability and renewable energy is how it's worked in the past. In my own research, I look at the history of the entire Alps as a landscape of renewable energy, which I call Europe's battery. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a few seconds. But I think we can help shed light on a historical episode where renewable energy was developed quite successfully, which I mean to say on a large scale in the Alps. And we can shed light on how different societal groups thought about hydropower in particular in the Alps, and what some of the environmental consequences and social consequences of this development have been. So Patrick just gave us a little more of a zoom in on a particular case. I'm going to zoom out a little bit and try to contextualize in general how hydroelectricity was developed in the Alps in the 19th and 20th century, really up until today. To start, I think it's important to keep in mind that when talking about hydroelectricity, as I'll be doing, that the energy involved in hydropower comes from humans intervening into the water cycle. and the special role that the Alps have played in the history of hydropower usage has a lot to do with the place of mountains in this very cycle. So this is a somewhat simplified illustration here, but you can see this is the hydrological cycle, the water cycle, a natural reoccurring flow of energy that happens where humans have intervened in order to create, what is often referred to as useful energy. And so this is where ultimately all of the energy that we're deriving from hydroelectricity, from hydropower dams, is by inserting ourselves into this cycle. So in the latter half of the 19th century, many people began to look at alpine water differently. Particularly in this case, I'm thinking about industrialists and engineers. And they began to view in the water streaming down from the peaks something that they began to refer to as white coal, or weiße Kohle in German. This here is an example of a trade journal of engineers who are interested in this question of alpine hydropower. So by white coal, what they meant was the energy of water that was derived from the snow fields of the high Alps. And I think it's important to pay a little bit of attention to this term, white coal or weiße Kohle, because it reveals quite a bit about attitudes at that time towards this potential energy. So they called it white coal because they argued that this water power, if harnessed, could bring industrial wealth to the alpine region, such as it existed in those areas that were already industrializing based upon coal. So thinking about England or the Ruhr in Germany. So this was a positive association that they were making with coal, that the alpine water power had this potential to transform the region economically. So this is coming in 1909. The people already started talking about white coal by the latter third of the 19th century. I'm going to fast forward over a great deal of history here, which is to say, most of the 20th century, and simply tell you that over the course of the 20th century, Europeans made extensive use of this white coal. So I'm fast forwarding through decades of tumultuous history in which alpine water power actually played a role in terms of the world wars, for example, but simply try to give you a picture of how expansive and extensive the Alps are as an energy landscape nowadays. So in a recent survey, it was noted that something like 550 hydropower plants of greater than 10 megawatt capacity exist in the Alps. So 10 megawatts can power roughly 10,000 houses annually. So these are just hydropower plants of 10 megawatts capacity or greater. So that's a fair amount of electricity, something on the order of 2,900 gigawatts. In terms of actual annual production, something like 96 terawatt hours are produced annually in the Alps, or were as of roughly the turn of the 21st century. And to give you some sort of comparison of what it would take to produce this energy burning fossil fuels, otherwise, this is about the same amount of energy that would come from 23 million tons of hard coal. So this is quite a lot of energy. It makes the Alps really sort of one of Europe's foremost electricity producing regions. You could compare it to French nuclear power and the fossil fuel fields that have powered electricity traditionally. Here's another way to try to visualize the extent of alpine hydropower. This map produced by the Alpine Convention gives us a sense of the location and the extent of large dams and reservoirs in the Alps. So these are dams generally over 10 meters in height. Now, I realize the resolution isn't really high, but you can sort of see the extensiveness of these dams. The red dots, by the way, indicate dams and reservoirs solely for power production. That's something that's been unique about the Alps, is The dams here have primarily been about energy usage and not about irrigation, as is common in the rest of the world. From a world historical perspective, this is something really, really unique. Normally, lakes tend to disappear naturally. They tend to eventually erode their banks and empty themselves. But what has happened over the course of the 20th century, essentially, is that humans have reversed these geological trends and actually created new lakes on the alpine landscape. So that should also give you a sense then of the intervention into nature that's happened here. Now, I'm going to conclude my thoughts here, returning to Austria, with a consideration about the quality of alpine renewable energy, the quality of alpine hydroelectricity, because often when energy is spoken about, people are usually focused on quantities of energy. But I want to argue that particularly when we're talking about renewable energy sources, the quality of this energy is decisive too, and particularly as regards the Alps. So over the course of the 20th century, engineers argued that the Alps were special because the mountains offered so many opportunities to store this natural flow of energy, to store water power that did not exist elsewhere. And these opportunities were glaciers or ice fields. They were existing natural lakes, but they were also valleys that could be dammed and then used to store water. So what's really special about the Alps, and it's why I refer to them as Europe's battery, is that they are a landscape of energy storage, of large-scale storage of renewable energy. And this is a landscape that enables storage that does not exist in very many other contexts. So this poster that we're looking at here directly then connects to this. This is a poster coming from post-World War II Austria. And it was meant, this was the late 1940s, to explain to Austrians why did they need to save electricity or conserve electricity. And if you look at the text and the images there, it explains that in the winter time, when the alpine water and the rivers are running low, less energy can be produced. And so people will have to continue to save energy in the winter until Austria completes its major storage dams. And at that point, then this problem will be solved. So this happened all over the Alps. It was not only in Austria that these storage opportunities were exploited, but I think it's an issue that needs to be discussed when thinking about renewable energy in particular. And I'll stop there and open it up hopefully to some questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both for giving us an idea of what hydropower is all about and some of its uses. This sets us up really well to dive into our first question, which is centered around the idea of how hydropower has evolved over time. So I'll kick us off with a couple of questions, and then we'll go into audience Q&A as well. So from a historical perspective, early hydroelectric development didn't occur under the label of renewability, and Europeans perceived hydroelectricity in a different light in the past, as we just mentioned. One popular conception was that alpine water power was white coal, which Marc just talked about, or in other words, energy coming from mountain snowfields with the potential to transform society as coal had done. Using rivers for transport, which was also done for centuries, can also be seen as a form of renewable energy. Can you talk a little bit more about how the use of hydropower has changed over time? And at what point did it transition to something that we would recognize today as hydropower for renewable electricity generation?
Patrick, did you want to?
Oh, go first.
Okay, I'm just noticing in the chat here, by the way, I'm sorry that I didn't realize my screen was on presenter view the whole time. I apologize for that. Anna-Katharina, could you just repeat the last sentence of the question and I'll be happy.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, just talking a little bit more about how hydropower has changed over time, and at what point did it transition to something that we would recognize today as hydropower for renewable energy generation?
Yeah, so I mean, it has changed. In some ways, it's changed drastically. In other ways, it's been relatively stable over centuries. And as Patrick mentioned, people have in the Alps and all over have actually been using water power far beyond the 19th century or far earlier than that. It was just in the form of mills, right? And so water as an energy source, as a prime mover, has been with us really since antiquity. What begins to change in the 19th century are the ways of converting water. And in the story of the Alps, what really stands out are two major technological innovations. And one of them is the creation of the turbine. So this is essentially a new form of water wheel that's metallic. But what's special for the Alps is that it allows for large falls to be harnessed of thousands of meters. And so it's only in the mid-19th century when a turbine is invented that the true potential of alpine water power can really be harnessed. And so that's why the Alps emerge at this point as a landscape of really lucrative energy sources. So that's one thing. Patrick also mentioned electricity as a key development. With electricity, there was a technology that allowed for the first time long distance transportation of this renewable energy source. Most renewable energy sources prior to electricity were really bound to the places where they were generated. That goes for wind and water as well. With electricity, you could transport it. And as Patrick mentioned, the way that alpine water power was developed was it was harnessed on a large scale and sent then to centers of consumption. And this really started in the 1920s and sort of culminated in the post-war period. So I would say those technological developments have been really, really important. Maybe Patrick wants to talk a little more about when water power began to be seen as renewable, or at least how people talked about hydropower in the early 20th century.
Well, I actually see when we start into the electricity era, I see a lot of continuities. I mean, hydropower was not talked about as renewable, it was much more talked about as a national resource, as something that would allow energy autarky, which became more and more important when you think at the two world wars, World War I first and World War II, but even before, when there were some strikes in the Saarland, for example, where coal was imported from, and they got difficulties to get to coal in the Alpine regions. This was a strong argument to develop your own sources. So it was actually also very strongly framed as a national resource. But on the other hand, from the beginning, it was also exported. And one very important point is these high voltage lines, power lines, which allowed to export them actually from the beginning from these alpine production centers well into several European regions. So actually I see here one of the continuities. It was also looked at as being cleaner than coal, and I mean that they called it white coal is of course because it looked like white when you see falling water. But the other thing is of course that white is also the color that stands for cleanliness. And so coal electricity was said to be much cleaner, safer than for example gas. Where we always had problems with it, or could have potential problems by using it in urban contexts. So it should be electricity should be safer as well. And here I really see actually a lot of continuities, and there is also I mean when we come to more recent times, that people started to talk about renewable energies, which I think begins with the 70s. And when people got worried about lots of environmental problems that were connected with oil, And first they thought that oil would end at some time. This was the huge problem. And afterwards they started to worry about that it wouldn't end early enough, so that we have the problem of climate change. And in this context, there was a lot of discussion of renewables, of different renewables. And at least in the German-speaking context, they started to talk about the new renewables, which is wind, solar power, especially, sometimes also some new kinds of biomass energy production. And also we know that all these uses of energy are also very long traditions, reaching back for decades and even centuries. They tended to call the water power or electricity from water power as the old renewable energy, and distinguish it from these other kinds of sources, because water power was established, and so didn't want to have the same problems that the new renewables had, like solar power or wind power, but still count as renewable.
Yeah, so that's actually a super interesting point about how hydropower is different. And also you mentioned the idea of energy autonomy. So one other thing that made hydropower special initially in the early 20th century was its ability to be stored. And unlike other renewable energy such as wind, this is actually something that made the Alps really unique. And from an engineering perspective, energy storage has been and continues to be a major engineering challenge. And so can you elaborate on the ways in which this has affected the structure of electricity systems in and beyond the Alps? And further, can you tell us more about how hydropower can be used not just as storage, but also for peak load and to balance other renewables on the grid, such as wind and solar?
Sure. Yeah. So, I wanted to touch on this a little bit in my slides, which hopefully you could see a little bit of. But yeah, so I think what I've recognized in my research is that really starting around the turn of the 20th century, but intensifying after the First World War, are arguments mostly among engineers that the real unique aspect of the Alps is that they are a landscape that allows for storing water power, hydropower. And if you look in the conversations that engineers are having, and electrical engineers, but also politicians eventually, they complain that hydropower has disadvantages compared to coal. They see that it is being not as convenient. And the issue is that its availability fluctuates. And in the Alps, in the Northern Hemisphere, right, it's during the winter time that there's the least amount of energy available. And people note that that's precisely the time when the most energy is needed for heating, for lighting. And so the common complaint is this is not as good of an energy source. We need to take action to make it fit into this industrial economy that was being built. And so the main solution that is found is to store it in lakes primarily and dams. And the thing about the Alps too is because of that relief, because of the height, if you can store a small amount of water, the height, the relief actually lends it even more energy potential. So they started to try to build reservoirs in the highest possible in the Alps as a way to counterbalance this. So what happens then primarily after the Second World War is the Alps come to play a role of peak power for the European energy grid as it's being constructed. And what I mean by peak is it was alpine dams that were tasked with providing energy to meet the peaks in demand that happened over the daily scale, but also longer periods like seasons as well. And so that still is in large part one of the major functions of alpine renewable energy, at least as far as hydroelectricity is concerned, is that it's this peak power for the European energy grid.
just to add a small point, what I also started to develop after World War II was this kind of power plants like the one I showed, the Engadiner Kraftwerk, and where they could also pump up water. So when there was more than enough energy, and which is also important, when electricity was very cheap on the market, they used it actually to pump up water. So using electricity with these plants, and then they waited until the prices got high up, and when there was large demand and high prices, then only then they started their turbines and produced electricity for the European net and sold it. And this was for a long time, a very easy going and very profitable way of using these plants and earning lots of money.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to reflect on whether the development of renewable energy in the Alps has been sustainable socially and environmentally, because of course that's always an element as well. And there are always trade-offs with any form of energy production. And of course, in the case of hydropower, there are potential issues around relocation of inhabitants, the loss of arable land, flood control, and economic feasibility in terms of building new transmission, which has been briefly mentioned, so that we can actually reach population centers, just to name a few examples. So I'd be really curious to hear more about how sustainable the development has been and where you see room for improvement.
Patrick, do you want to start? Or?
So shall I start?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we have seen that all over the world that people, whole villages, actually towns have been relocated to build dams and to flood these areas, and sometimes thousands, 10,000, millions of people. And you go to China, or a latest example in Turkey as well. And compared to this, there are small numbers, we have to say, in the Alps, but this has also to do with the fact that these dams are very high up, where the area is scarcely populated. But it has also happened. Several villages in Switzerland, especially in Italy, were relocated, so people lost their homes, had to move somewhere else. Much more happened also that pasture lands were flooded, so they some kind of lost their livelihoods, which meant often that also they had to migrate and to take up a new life. And this was surely accompanied with quite some hardships. I mean, some people profited from it, also from moving, but this gave a hard time. So this is, I think, one of the questions of how social sustainability we should also always, I think about when we talk about sustainability. Often we think only on environmental sustainability. We should also think about social and economic sustainability.
Yes, I can only second that. And I think this kind of connects to, I'm looking in the chat, I think it's Wilhelmine has asked this question about whether the awareness of the negative effects of hydropower on habitats, whether there's a difference between Austria, Switzerland, and France. And maybe you could speak some more to this too, Patrick, but in general terms, I would say it's been pretty similar in all three countries. All three countries in the post-war period, really up until the 1970s, did build a number of high altitude, very large dam systems. These were the ones that probably had the greatest, I don't want to say this, but they had environmental impacts, and in some cases required people or caused people to have to relocate, villages to relocate. And so I want to say that after 1970, with the rise of the environmental movement in these countries that are mentioned, it was generally similar, that there was a turn away from large hydropower projects for the most part. And so, yes, in terms of environmental effects, as you mentioned, Anna-Katharina, there are trade-offs involved with every sort of energy utilization. And so there have been those with hydropower as well. I think from an environmental standpoint, probably the most high profile have been, the loss of fisheries and fish migrations that used to take place in the Alps, particularly salmon in the Rhine. And so you can point to a number of sort of environmental consequences that have been caused by this development. But Patrick, I don't know, what do you think? Is the perception generally similar throughout the Alps?
I guess so. The perception is similar. There's also a huge support in all these countries from the general public for developing the water powers. I think the possibilities to resist it for local population was different. When you go to Switzerland, or you go to fascist Italy, for example, also to the Italian Republic, to France. So this depends on the political system, but as you can see, even also in Switzerland, where local population has a lot to say, there have been several villages flooded, but there were also huge projects that couldn't be built because of local opposition. So they could not overcome local opposition. So if there was a firm opposition in Switzerland, there was no way to get around it. Well, there are a few differences. I mean, if we look at costs, of course, when we look at environmental costs, we also have to say that there are not very many rivers left that have not been developed. I've just seen recently a figure for Tyrol, and the amount of undeveloped rivers in percentages is 0.5. which means 99.5% of rivers in Tyrol are in one kind or the other developed.
Super interesting. I think I'm going to just ask one more question, and then we can turn it over to the audience questions, since there are quite a few coming in. So maybe if you both want to just touch on this briefly, building off of these ideas. Large-scale hydro has already been built out mostly since its development in the 70s, and we know that building new hydropower can bring developers into conflict with nature protection organizations and have other issues. Currently, the challenge is actually trying to bring more out of existing hydro plants. So how can new hydro projects play a role, and how much can still be built out without negatively impacting the environment? What kinds of technologies are you seeing that are really exciting in this space, or what kinds of policy changes do you think would be needed to be made to make this more viable? Maybe Mark, if you want to start with this one.
Sure, great question, Anna-Katharina. So it's a tough question, because as we noted, there's going to be environmental impacts always associated with any kind of energy use. And as we know, with climate change, sources like hydropower, where greenhouse gases are not being produced at production, are needed quickly. And so you would think then that hydropower might be facing a increase in the future. And what I'm seeing, I focus mostly on the past, but I'm seeing more recently, there's been a focus on trying, as you said, much has been developed, maybe trying to expand what already exists through things like pump storage. There is a movement for smaller scale hydropower that would serve local needs rather than being transported. That's a potential avenue. And I just think in general, what I noticed from doing the historical research is that it's very tricky to say, okay, we've reached we've tapped out all of the potential of hydropower, because estimates of how much hydropower exists in the Alps change very much over the course of the 20th century, because these estimates are very much dependent upon what society deems as suitable to be developed, and that can change very much too. So there could also be a future where large dams are also being advocated for, maybe with the melting of glaciers as well, which was one of the questions that I saw in the chat. So it's tough for a historian to predict the future, or we try to stay away from it usually, but I do see that there will be an increased role for hydropower moving forward. What do you think, Patrick?
Well, I completely agree with you. I think that there are more potential in the Alps, but the main question is if we really want to harness this potential, because as I explained before, most rivers are already developed. There are only very few left that are not, and I actually believe we shouldn't touch them. So the costs are too high. So, but we should really also, when we think at sustainability, leave these untouched rivers for future generations. So my opinion is that we can optimize some of these existing power plants, but actually we should do with what we have. And this brings me actually to one general point. I think first priority in general, when we look at energy transitions, is to reduce energy consumption. So the cleanest kilowatt hour is the one that has never been produced. And second priority is stop subsidizing fossil fuels, but tax them and make them pay for their environmental costs. And only third priority should be the expansion of new energy sources, including renewables.
Yeah, completely agreed. Efficiency is really the first thing that we need to prioritize before moving on to any new capacity expansion. So that's really so important to mention. But I'll switch over now to some of the questions from the audience. One person asks, what is the plan now that the glaciers are melting and the storage capacity is reducing, so we have lower snow and ice levels over time? And also, what is the calculation of returning water to be recycled through the turbines? It must take more energy to do this, so is the energy created more, do we need more energy to be able to do that? Patrick, maybe do you want to start, or do you want to answer this question?
Well, that's good, but also difficult questions to answer, especially for historians, or for me as a historian. I just know that this is, of course, is a large discussion with climate warming, melting glaciers, also melting frozen soils, which also brings lots of new dangers in the Alps, and they expect actually to have less water, which of course speaks against building new power plants, new dams, speaks a bit to trying to tap new waterways for existing plants, because when they build such a dam, they not just take one river, but they take several rivers and direct them into these reservoirs. So that's something I think we can already seeing happen. The second part, I'm not sure if I really understand it, because returning water to the to be recycled, because this needs energy to do it. Is this the question, why they do it, or how have you understood this?
The way I interpret it is just how does this change the overall flow of energy through the region, or water through the region, the whole hydropower cycle, because now you have this imbalance with more water in the system because of melting glaciers. So I believe that's what was meant by the question, but of course, feel free to elaborate if you meant something else.
Oh, no, I mean, if you look actually at the whole Alps, I mean, this is nowadays a huge envirotechnical system. These are not single plants, these are not single rivers, but they are connected in many, many ways through this power production, but also through many channels, dams, and so on. So I think this probably will add to the challenge to manage this whole system. I mean, there's already now a challenge because nature is dynamic, and these systems are kind of stable and non-dynamic, and to manage dynamic resources with a non-dynamic system is a change anyway. And if it gets more dynamic, what we have to expect with climate change, I think the challenge will be even be larger.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, we can say that the entire grid is changing so much with the addition of wind and solar now. And so that's really a big challenge overall that many countries are facing. So overall, just keeping in mind that the entire system is dynamic. But just switching gears for...
Can I just real quickly, I'm just very
of course.
briefly. No, just I think, Patrick, what I meant was, you know, this question of the melting of the glaciers with climate change and with the disappearance of glaciers, the fluctuations of the annual variability of flows of water in the Alps is going to change, and it could get much more extreme. And so what I meant to say was I can see a future where there are calls to build more dams to store what water, you know, the precipitation that's falling in the Alps when the glaciers are no longer around as sort of reservoirs that even out and mitigate flows over the year. You know, as happens in much of the world, dams would be used to store water, not just for energy in this case, but also to even out you know, extreme fluctuations. I'm not saying that this should happen, but I can envision there being renewed calls for dams for that purpose. Sorry, Anna-Katarina, go ahead.
No, of course, good point as well. So I think this is also an interesting question. What role do green parties play in the Alpine countries in this energy sustainability discourse? And maybe to add to that, we can say more from a historical perspective, how does policy really interact with the space, and how can it be used to influence energy development? So what lessons have we learned from policy in the past in this space?
Patrick, would you maybe want to go?
So again, okay. No, that's I think the role of the green parties is very interesting because of course they are generally in favor of renewable energies, but they are against its environmental costs. So which means they normally, and if you expand it also to nature protection organizations, which normally are very near to the green parties, they are against expansion, of course, of hydroelectric power generation or of building new power plants. So this is sometimes also a question. Maybe you know also this about even more about this when it comes to wind power. Of course, normally green parties are in favor of using renewable energies, even also of using wind power, but there are some resistance against it because there are problems with oh God. I just missed the words with bird populations, of course, for example, and so it's I would say in general they are for it, but when it comes to individual cases, they can also be against it.
So just real quick, something that I think is interesting to look at historically as well. You know, in terms of the politics of the development of renewable energy, after the 1920s, after the First World War in particular, you see in just about every Alpine country that the state played a major role in building a lot of these dams, meaning that the state intervened into the electricity supply and actually owned and operated a lot of these dams. That has changed again since the late 1990s. There's been a fair amount of liberalization there, but you know, when a lot of the larger dams were put up, this was in an era when the state took a strong role in developing energy. So something to think about as well.
Okay, well, I feel like there's so much more we can talk about on this subject, but it looks like we're out of time. I want to thank both of our panelists again for joining us for this truly interesting discussion where we learned about hydropower significance in the Alps, past, present, and future, and how other types of renewable energy will also play an important role as we transition, and indeed both Austria and the world to 100% renewable energy. I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel, and of course the audience for listening and for sticking around. So thank you all.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our moderator, Anna Katarina, Mark, and Patrick for your very insightful contributions today. And of course to the audience for joining us and for your great questions. I've put a link in the chat to our event survey. So if you could take a couple of minutes to fill that out, we would appreciate that. And we hope you'll join us for our next session in this series on May 26th on sustainable transportation and smart cities with the UC Berkeley Institute of Transportation Studies and the Institute of Transportation at the University of Austria in Vienna. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon or evening from wherever you're joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, thanks.
Bye, thank you everyone.